So to illustrate those stakes, I'm going to share a little anecdote, a story from 1961. Pictured there is a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber. Now, not this particular one, but a B-52 bomber was flying over the United States in January of 1961. And when it got over a town called Goldsboro, North Carolina, this bomber began to break apart, malfunction. And as a result of this aircraft malfunction, 2 of the bombs it was carrying dropped. It was carrying hydrogen bombs. 2 of them fell to the ground. In fact, the power of those bombs had the blast equivalent of 4 million tons of TNT, of dynamite. The power of those bombs that were now plummeting toward an American town was 200 times larger than the bomb that leveled Hiroshima, Japan in August 1945. Now, each of those bombs was equipped with 4 safety devices that were supposed to prevent it from accidentally exploding when they weren't intended to. Now, those bombs hit the ground and did not detonate, fortunately. But when searchers recovered one of the bombs, they discovered that 3 out of the 4 safety devices had failed. Now, we only learned about this in recent years. Thanks to a Freedom of Information Act request by a writer by the name of Eric Schlosser. So thanks to one functioning safety mechanism in that bomb, we can thank that for the prevention of a detonation over an American state. It's predicted that the bomb, if it had detonated, would have produced a radiation plume that would have reached almost to southern New Jersey and killed some 60,000 people. It was, of course, World War II that ushered in the nuclear age and made an incident like this possible. World War II, as we discussed last week, was the deadliest and costliest war in world history. And by the end of the war, the U.S. had unlocked and used the potential of the deadliest weapon ever created by humans. But then after the war, they would create even deadlier bombs. But those first atomic bombs would cast a shadow over the ensuing years, the decades we refer to as the Cold War. So first, let's start with the basics. It's a term often used, but maybe we should still be clear and define it. The Cold War gets its name because it was a competition and rivalry between the world's 2 preeminent powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. What made it cold in quote marks, is that Americans and Russians never battled each other on the battlefield. This Cold War involved threats, diplomacy, economic competition, spying, and arms buildup. These were all part of the Cold War story, as we'll talk about this week and when we talk about Vietnam, also part of this story were proxy wars in other parts of the world. A proxy war is when, in the Cold War case, the US and Soviet Union have a rooting interest and may support one side or the other, but are playing like a game of chess against one another. but not actually meeting each other on the battlefield. In order to understand how that wartime relationship fell apart, we have to actually look back at those war years and the conclusion and consequences of the Second World War. As we know, the U.S. entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Soon Germany declared war on the United States as well, and the gauntlet had been thrown down. And as the war progressed and went in the favor of the Allies being the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, American and British troops advanced on Germany from the west, and Soviet forces were advancing from the east, until the writing was on the wall. And Germany would ultimately surrender, as we know. Now, before that German surrender came, the big three, who are pictured here, the leaders of those chief allied nations, the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Union, met from time to time to discuss their war aims and to try to plan what the post-war world would look like after this most damaging and disastrous war. One of those meetings took place in November to December 1943 in Tehran, Iran. This is where the blueprint for the post-war world began to be set. This was taking place during the war. Note the date. Talking about the final months of 1943. The war in Europe would not end until May 1945. So it was in 1943 that the Allies met in Tehran, Iran, to discuss what the post-war world would look like. In that picture, you see Joseph Stalin to the left of the screen. He was the premier of the Soviet Union, a brutal, homicidal dictator. In the middle is U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And next to him is Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. These three men were known as the Big Three. They were the power players, the heads of what would be the victorious nations, and they, in large part, would be responsible for redrawing the map of the post-war world. Major decisions were made in Tehran. The one most relevant for us today is that at this meeting, the Big Three decided to divide or petition post-war Germany to try to prevent its rise into another aggressive superpower, as it had after the First World War. This divided Germany would be partitioned among the three nations, Soviet Union, US, and Britain, each of which would get a zone it would be responsible for managing. Each would have its own sphere of influence within Germany, as it were. Now, the end of the war is still some time away, and at this point it was not clear exactly how long a divided Germany would be in place. Now, to jump ahead a little bit, Germany would be divided until the late 80s and early 90s, though that was not part of the plan. Jumping ahead to the final year of the war, it's 1945, February, early in the year, and there are only a few months left of the war. Now, of course, we did not know that at this time, but by February 1945, the Allies were pretty confident that the war would end in their favor. It was only a matter of when. The pressure was now on to make more concrete decisions about the post-war world. Decisions made at Yalta, Ukraine, would be fateful. You see here the same three men representing the Allies. You have Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. You may note that Roosevelt is looking much more sickly than he did in the previous photo. And in fact, Roosevelt would die a few months later in April. Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and President Franklin Roosevelt began to grow more concerned about Soviet power in the post-war world. At this meeting in Yalta, the Big Three agreed that Germany would, one of their big decisions was that Germany would pay reparations. In other words, they would kind of repay, in part, the cost of the war fought by the Allies. So that's one concrete decision. Two, it was decided at Yalta that post-war Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones. One of them would be administered by the United States, one of those zones. A second occupation zone would be administered by the British. A third zone occupied by the Soviets. And the fourth by the French. Now, the French had surrendered to a German invasion back in 1940, but as the Allies invaded Europe and made their way across the continent toward Germany, they had significant assistance from the Free French who were fighting to reclaim their nation. And so France is brought in on this planning. The Big Three at this meeting also agreed on this third thing, the creation of a United Nations, the UN, which would replace a previous organization that had kind of failed after the First World War. So those are 3 of the big things. First, German reparations. 2, 4 occupation zones in post-war Germany. 3, the creation of a United Nations. This fourth one is indicative of the growing tensions among the Big Three. They also agreed on a policy of self-determination in Europe. Now, what that meant, self-determination, is that a people should be free to govern themselves without outside interference, without a conqueror from abroad managing their affairs. And this was a significant concern for Churchill and Roosevelt because as the Soviet army makes its way west on its way to invading Germany, and the Soviets arrive in Germany's capital, Berlin, before the other Allies do, Stalin leaves troops in those countries in between the Soviet Union and Germany. And so there's a growing concern that those troops are going to remain there and become part of the Soviet bloc. So what this means is that at Yalta, the Big Three called for a liberated, free, and democratic Europe. Now, Stalin signed off on this, but he would not keep this promise. His minions would engineer overthrows of popularly supported governments and set up puppet governments throughout Eastern Europe that were occupied by his armies. Romania and Poland, for example. This grand alliance, which was based on having a common enemy, was being strained by Stalin's failure to adhere to his agreements at Yalta. This would be a view of the post-war relationship between Western Europe and the United States on one side and the Soviet Union and its satellites on the other. Now, the war in Europe would come to an end in May 1945, VE Day. But there was still the matter of defeating Japan. Fighting was still going on in the Pacific. Before war with Japan ceased, there was another meeting among the Big Three in July 1945 at Potsdam. Now, by this time, of course, Germany had already surrendered, but the war was going on in the Pacific. I want to note the change in the makeup of the Big Three. The only one still remaining is Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier, and you see him in the white shirt, black pants. Sitting next to him is not Franklin Roosevelt. As I mentioned earlier, Roosevelt died in April 1945, and he was succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman, and that's who's pictured there in the center seat. Harry Truman had been a Democratic senator from Missouri, and he and FDR did not have a close or warm or cooperative relationship. In fact, Roosevelt kept Truman in the dark about many things, including the development of the atomic bomb. So could you imagine being in Truman's shoes? Roosevelt dies in office. There's still a Second World War going on. He learns that the U.S. has developed the deadliest weapon ever known to humankind. And now you have to join the Big Three and try to bring this war to an end and establish a vision for the post-war world. A significant challenge, to be sure. You'll also note that Winston Churchill is missing from this photo, and that's because his party had been voted out of office. So in his place, you see Clement Attlee, who was the new prime minister of the Labour Party. He took over for Winston Churchill. So the one thing I want to stress about this particular meeting is the tensions that I mentioned that were bubbling up in Yalta. We're beginning to reach a boiling point here, and Truman was openly antagonistic toward Stalin. Now, Roosevelt was not trusting of Stalin, but he was more politic about his dealings with him. Truman, not so much. And so he wore his antagonistic attitude towards Stalin on his sleeve. And Truman was buoyed with the confidence that the U.S. had this weapon, the atomic bomb. Now, what he didn't know at the time was that Stalin knew about the bomb because there were Soviet spies in the United States. Another major decision for Truman that just fell into his lap was how to bring the war with Japan to an end. And he approved the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which did bring the war in the Pacific to an end. And these weapons, as I noted earlier, would cast a shadow over the post-war world, the Cold War world. Let's take a look at what post-war Europe looked like, because here's where the chessboard initially lay in the contest between the Soviet Union on one side and the US and its allies on the other. So this is what Europe looked like. Note, as you see in this map, that the Soviet Union gained new territory. You see that in the middle of the map between the Soviet Union and Poland. And between the Soviet Union and Romania, you see these new territories acquired by the Soviet Union. And it also expanded its sphere of influence. You see those neighboring countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and so on, were innate independent nations, but they operated under puppet governments installed by Stalin and his cronies. Essentially, these nations were satellites of the Soviet Union, whether they wanted to be or not. Also note in this map, you see the division of Germany. There's West Germany and East Germany. East Germany is the Soviet zone. And in the West, that's divided into the US, British, and French zones. On the upper right corner of the map, zooms in on the German capital city of Berlin, which, as indicated there, is in the middle of East Germany. So it's in the middle of the Soviet zone, but the city itself is divided among the four major powers: the Soviets, French, British, and Americans. So that's going to be important in a few minutes when we talk about the Berlin airlift. I also want to note, this is a term I'll come back to in a few moments. This map, there's a red line through the middle of Europe on this map. And this red line is called the, quote, Iron Curtain. It's a term that Winston Churchill would use. Yes, he was out of power in Britain, but he would signal the warning over and over again against the aggression of the Soviet Union. And so east of that line, east of that Iron Curtain, and even parts to the west of that line, like Albania, as noted on the map, were within the Soviet sphere of influence behind what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. So there were early warnings. The American ambassador to the Soviets issued what becomes known as the Long Telegram in 1946, in which he warns that, as quoted on the screen there, the USSR, or Soviet Union, still lives in antagonistic capitalist encirclement with which, in the long run, there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence. What he's suggesting there is that from the Soviet point of view, Stalin, his handlers, and others feel as if they are encircled by antagonistic states, capitalist encirclement, and that they can never be secure unless they have a presence in those territories near the Soviet Union, surrounding the Soviet Union. And he notes, Kennan does, that there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence. Now, he doesn't advocate for outright war with the Soviet Union. The world is still recovering from the disaster that was World War II. But Kennan's telegram would be the basis for the future American policy of containment, which we'll talk more about in a moment. If full-on invasion and open warfare were undesirable options, as they were to so many, the tack that Truman and others take in the post-war years during the Cold War is that they will attempt to contain the influence and power of the Soviet Union. So another who is signaling the warning against Soviet aggression is Winston Churchill. In March 1946, in the United States, he makes this speech at a college in Missouri, his Iron Curtain speech. In his speech, he warned of the power of the Soviet Union. He said that behind an iron curtain, and that's a powerful image because a curtain, when it's made of iron, of course, it's hard to penetrate and you can't see through it. So behind that iron curtain lies a Soviet sphere where the Soviet Union controlled its satellite nations. It was a warning that Harry Truman and other American leaders would take to heart as Cold War conflict would escalate in the years ahead. Soon enough, world leaders would be forced to put their cards on the table. The first inciting incident was the beginning of a civil war in Greece in 1946. The division in Greece was between communist groups and anti-communist groups. The opponents of communism in Greece were aided by Great Britain, but Britain was in rough shape after the war. The United States, on the other hand, emerged from the war stronger than it had ever been, and so the challenge was before Truman and the US Congress. Would they retreat into an isolationist cocoon as the US did after the First World War? Or would they engage the world, use America's economic and military might to shape world affairs? Truman chose to try to lead and shape those affairs in the world. After all, he was already alarmed with the amount of influence the Soviet Union enjoyed throughout Eastern Europe. What would happen if Greece became a communist ally of the Soviet Union? This worried Truman and many others. And so in March 1947, Truman issued his famous Truman Doctrine. In his speech, Truman asked for economic and military aid for Greece and also for Turkey, which had been destabilized by the war and was experiencing internal dissent of its own. That aid was meant to help anti-communist forces against the communists. So, in this case, Truman was not calling for a declaration of war. His doctrine then was one of content. He promised to aid freedom-loving peoples throughout the world in order to stop the spread of communist influence. That was the essence of containment, prevent the spread of communism, especially the Soviet brand. And there's a quote from Truman's speech on the screen here. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. And he perceives the Soviet Union and communism as threats to freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, Truman goes on, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation. He's trying to make the case that what's in the best interest of Greece and best interests of Europe is in the best interest of the United States. Now, the Truman Doctrine was quite broad and open-ended. And in the case of Greece and Turkey, they're promising military aid, financial aid. But how would this commitment change in the years ahead? Well, we see, as a result of the Truman Doctrine and the ramping up of the Cold War, we see the escalation of the national security state. With the National Security Act of 1947, Truman establishes the National Security Council. This is something that is still in existence, a coterie of national security advisors to the president, and also establishes a Central Intelligence Agency, a spying agency. And we will return to the CIA later in this lecture. So as we saw, the first commitment through the Truman Doctrine was to lend aid to Greece and Turkey as they were trying to fend off communist takeover from within. That same year in 1947, Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, pictured there, proposes the Marshall Plan, which would go into effect the following year. This is massive amounts of aid to the countries that were decimated by the Second World War. Now, the goal here is twofold. One, the hope is that this support would help these nations get back on their feet after a devastating war and introduce some stability back into the region, and this will make them less prone to communist influence. So that's one hope with the Marshall Plan. The second one is, to be frank, to buy some friends. The U.S. could call in its debts when it needed them, when it needed to. So millions and millions of dollars would flow from the United States into Europe to help those nations rebuild after the war. And you see, of course, the money flows most heavily toward America's closest allies during the war, Britain and France. It also goes to West Germany, as indicated there. Now, it's worth noting that the U.S. actually, and this may sound strange, the U.S. actually offered Marshall Plan money to the Soviet Union, which it declined, feeling that this was America's attempt to kind of gain influence on them and create a kind of dependent relationship. So these are just a couple of the methods of the Truman Doctrine. Now, the ones we've seen so far, the commitment is in money, which is significant. But as we'll see, there would be a wide range of commitments as a result of the Truman Doctrine. And we'll look at those more as we press on. But before we get to more examples of the Truman Doctrine at work abroad, I want to take a look closer to home, because anxiety was hitting there. On March 21st, 1947, President Truman issued an executive order, Order 9835. This order required that federal civil service employees be screened for loyalty. The criteria for potential disloyalty was, quote, membership in, affiliation with, or sympathetic association with any organization determined by the Attorney General, the chief law enforcer in the nation, to be, quote, totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive, or, in quote, to alter the form of government of the United States by unconstitutional means. The Justice Department compiled a list of what it determined to be 50 organizations that were considered potentially subversive. And based on that list, a list of government employees who had associated with those groups was compiled. The process by which these lists was compiled is almost completely opaque. It's not clear at all how certain groups were determined to be subversive and others weren't. As a result of these lists, more than 4.5 million employees in the U.S. government were investigated. Of that number, 378 employees were dismissed as security risks, and another 5,000 resigned under pressure. Furthermore, this list of potential subversives generated by Truman's executive order was quickly adopted by a wide variety of groups state governments, the US military, and even some private businesses. And so the impact of this loyalty review board went even beyond the halls of the. Other groups came under scrutiny as well, including organized labor. Now, socialism and communism as ideologies were meant to appeal to workers. And organized workers, labor unions, were made a target with the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Though union membership would continue to rise for the next several years, reaching its height in 1953, this act would, in the long run, significantly weaken labor's strength. Here's what the Taft-Hartley Act accomplished. First, it declared the so-called closed shop illegal. A closed shop is a workplace that is open only to members of a union. So this could undermine the power of specific unions in specific workplaces. This act also enabled the president to issue an 80-day injunction to halt strikes. Now, one of the main sources of leverage for workers is that they could declare a work stoppage. Their work, coupled with their numbers, though, that makes up their power. And so that when they work together and call a strike, they could assert themselves in a powerful way. Thanks to this act, though, the president could issue an 80-day halt to the strike, which could cripple that organizing effort, that effort to secure gains for workers. 80 days is a long time, and the strike could lose steam, and it gives employers more leverage. This is meant to undermine the bargaining power of unions. And then, more in keeping with the anti-communist sentiment of the time, the Taft-Hartley Act requires union members to take an oath stating that they are not communists. And so there was much finger-pointing within labor unions about who had affiliation with communist groups, who did not, who was active and who wasn't. There was great suspicion in Congress of organized labor. But not only organized labor. New federal legislation targeted communist subversion and spread fear of communist infiltration, Congress began to conduct a series of high-profile hearings on the subject. These hearings were conducted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, which actually had been created back in 1938 and was revived in 1947. One of the targets of HUAC was Hollywood, was the film industry. Since the beginnings of motion pictures, many had feared the psychological impact of films. Could even subtle propaganda be snuck in films and brainwash moviegoers? Could pro-communist messages reach audiences through movies? In response to such questions, HUAC called Hollywood actors, producers, directors, and screenwriters to hearings to testify. Among those who testified were Ronald Reagan. He, at the time, was president of the Screen Actors Guild, the chief actors union in Hollywood. Of course, he would go on to be governor of California and, of course, U.S. president. Walt Disney was another who testified to HUAC. Reagan and Disney were sympathetic witnesses. They named names. They tried to ferret out communist influence in Hollywood. Another one called before HUAC and who identified other communists was the highly praised film director Elia Kazan. Now, Kazan himself had briefly been a member of the Communist Party USA. And to kind of save his own skin, he identified others in the Communist Party. Which, to be clear, communism was never terribly popular in the United States, though it did grow in some popularity during the Great Depression, which seemed to signal the failure of capitalism, and so some were looking for alternatives. Some joined the Communist Party during World War II because the US and Soviet Union were allies, not suspecting that after the war they would then become suspect themselves. Hollywood screenwriters tended to be liberal in their politics, and some were members of the Communist Party or suspected front groups. They had joined because of their politics. Some joined during the worst years of the Great Depression. Some joined once the USA and Soviet Union were allies during the Second World War. Others joined because friends were members or they wanted to get close to someone they wanted to date. There are a number of reasons why some could join, not all necessarily politically motivated, and not necessarily all nefarious. Those men I mentioned, Reagan, Disney, and Kazan, testified. A group of 10 Hollywood screenwriters refused to testify and instead read statements to the committee, to HUAC, denouncing its practices. After their refusal to testify, the Screen Actors Guild, which Reagan was the head of, voted to make members swear a pledge asserting that they were not communists. These 10, who became known as the Hollywood 10, were later cited for contempt of Congress and sentenced to a year in prison and forced to pay a $1,000 fine each. A longer lasting consequence was that the men who ran Hollywood studios put them on a blacklist. This was a list of people that they would refuse to hire because of their alleged or actual communist ties. This means that they would not be hired in Hollywood. Some never again. Some would eventually work in Hollywood again, but only under pseudonyms, adopted names. This Hollywood blacklist, which began with the Hollywood 10, would grow into the hundreds in the years ahead. Among the people called before HUAC was Alger Hiss, pictured here. Alger Hiss worked in the U.S. State Department and had for many years since the Roosevelt administration. In 1939, a man by the name of Whittaker Chambers, who himself was a former member of the Communist Party USA, told the State Department that Hiss was a communist spy. Other sources also warned of a Soviet spy in the State Department, though they did not name Hiss specifically. Because of these informants, the FBI began to investigate Hiss. Alger Hiss left the State Department in 1947 and sued Whittaker Chambers, his accuser, for libel. The following year, in 1948, Chambers testified before HUAC and made the case that Hiss was a Soviet spy with the so-called Pumpkin Papers. These Pumpkin Papers were State Department microfilm that Hiss had allegedly copied and sent to the Soviet Union and kept at Chambers' pumpkin farm hidden in pumpkins. Hiss would go on trial, but not for espionage. He would be charged with and convicted of perjury, lying under oath, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. He, to his dying day, denied that he was a spy. But documents that have been declassified since the fall of the Soviet Union seem to indicate that Hiss very likely was a spy, as Chambers had accused. So this shows that there was a real threat of subversion, and there were American spies in the Soviet Union, Soviet spies in the United States, typical espionage among rivals. But Hiss is important in another way. His image, he was Ivy League educated, a liberal, seemingly an innocuous figure who could blend in. He became a symbol for possible communist subversion, and he, as a symbol, could be used to paint Ivy League educated intellectuals, liberals, as communist sympathizers, if not communists themselves. And while there were fears of threats from within, there were also developments outside the US that increased the alarm in the United States. One indication of this was the so-called Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949. So think back to that map we saw a few minutes ago. Post-war Germany is partitioned, divided among the French, British, Soviets, and Americans. And the capital city of Berlin, nestled in the middle of the Soviet zone in East Germany, itself is divided. So in the middle of 1948, Joseph Stalin, still in power, he would die in 1953, Joseph Stalin grows alarmed that West Germany, made up of the American, British, and French sectors, was becoming more cohesive. They were working more closely together, coming up with a currency reform and reforms that would unite the region. And in response to this, to forestall these developments, Stalin ordered a blockade of the city of Berlin. He surrounded the city to prevent Allied supplies from getting to West Berlin. And he could do this because, as you've seen on the map, Berlin is within East Germany. So Truman has another challenge on his hands. This is an act of aggression by the Soviet Union. Does he respond with a military strike? How does he respond? He decides to respond with an airlift. If trains and trucks are not going to get into Berlin, then planes will fly overhead and drop supplies on West Germany and keep it afloat during this blockade. During the Berlin airlift, the US and its Western allies flew 13,000 tons of supplies daily to Berlin, and thus were able to break the Soviet land blockade of the city. So the Berlin airlift, you could say, was a successful exercise of American might that did not involve military action. Well, to be clear, these are military planes, and there were some casualties. There were some plane crashes. But there was no invasion, no bombing of the Soviet Union. Instead, if you take a look at this poster by the aircraft manufacturer Douglas, they call milk the new weapon of democracy. They weren't dropping bombs, they were dropping milk and food. This allowed West Berlin to endure until Stalin lifted that blockade. So a momentary scare, but a scare nonetheless, showing that tensions between the nations were rising. And it shows the American commander-in-chief would have to think on his feet. is who knows what kind of challenge would be posed next and what kind of response it would require. Now, speaking of challenges, in 1949, the United States lost its monopoly on atomic weapons. In August of that year, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. In the years ahead, there would be a massive arms race between the two nations to see who could outproduce the other in these most destructive of weapons. So the stakes for this Cold War have just been raised. There's more than one nuclear power in the world. Another alarming development in 1949, Truman is still president, and so he's trying to balance what he sees as potential internal subversion and also threats from abroad. In 1949, a civil war in China, after many years, finally comes to an end. The consequence of this war, the civil war, is a communist China, a victory for the forces of Deng and his communists. So if the hope was to contain the spread of communism, what happened here? Is this a failure of containment? Did the US ignore China? Did it expect the side it favored to win? What happened here? And the question of, quote unquote, who lost China would bedevil many American politicians in the years ahead. And so there were further measures from American leaders that they believed were necessary to maintain American vigilance during the Cold War. And in 1950 came the McCarran Internal Security Act. McCarran was a U.S. senator who sponsored this bill. Take a look at what the McCarran Internal Security Act does. First, it requires communist organizations to register with the U.S. Attorney General. This way, they could be monitored. It establishes a board, the Subversive Activities Control Board, whose sole task is to investigate suspected communist subversion. So this is about monitoring, keeping tabs on Americans who are deemed potential subversives. And here's a controversial piece of this. It allows for the emergency detention of suspected subversives, communists. Emergency detention means that they don't have to be brought up on charges. Probable cause is optional. And so someone could be locked up and not told what they're being locked up for. That same year, in 1950, the Cold War would turn hot, so to speak. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. This is one of those aforementioned proxy wars in the Cold War. So some background. Since the early 20th century, the Korean Peninsula had been essentially a colony of Japan. Military occupation by Japan eventually led to political control. But with Japan's defeat in World War II, Korea was now independent. But as they had done with Europe, the victorious Allies agreed to partition Korea, this time into two parts, instead of Germany, which was partitioned into four. There would be, in the north, in North Korea, the Democratic Republic of Korea, which was a misnomer because that was supported by the Soviet Union. And in the south was the Republic of Korea, South Korea. That was supported by the United States. And so why did war break out here? In 1950, North Korea, with the blessing of the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea with the goal of creating a unified communist Korean state. So President Truman was faced with another challenge. In this instance, Truman would gain the support of the young United Nations and intervene militarily in Korea. American troops were dispatched to Korea, and they pushed the North Korean invaders back all the way to that blue line you see on the map. They made it there by November 1950. Now note where that blue line on the map is. It's very close to China's border. The newly communist China was alarmed at the advance of the American and UN forces and joined the fray. Chinese and North Korean troops would join forces and push the Americans and their UN allies back. Peace and end to the war eventually came in 1953, and it kept in place the status quo. Korea divided at the 38th parallel and still remains divided today into North Korea, Communist North Korea, and South Korea. Korean War was taking place. More developments at home, Cold War related developments. One was a Supreme Court case in 1951, Dennis versus the United States. Dennis is the man in the white suit and the mustache in that photo. Now, while the congressional hearings held by HUAC decried as show trials, there were actual courtroom trials taking place. This particular one, Dennis v. United States, was a Supreme Court case. As all Supreme Court cases do, this one started in the lower courts. Eugene Dennis and 10 other men were charged with, quote, advocating, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government in the United States by force or violence. In other words, to put that simply, Dennis and his cohort were accused of attempting to overthrow the government, or at least advocating for that. Dennis was General Secretary of the Communist Party USA. He was open about his membership. That wasn't a secret. And the 10 other petitioners in this case were also members of communist groups. In these trials, in these cases that made their way to the Supreme Court, the prosecution charged that as leaders of communist groups, they were part of a worldwide conspiracy to end capitalism and overthrow the US government by violent revolution. In other words, simply by virtue of their membership in these groups, they were guilty of these charges, guilty of these crimes, even if their own rhetoric never actually called for those things. Dennis, in his own defense, pointed out accurately that he and the other defendants were not charged with a single act of subversion, that no criminal act was even being alleged. In other words, there's no evidence of them spying, no evidence of them passing along top secret information, no evidence of them planting bombs at post offices or anything like that. They were not accused of committing actual subversive acts. And in fact, Dennis argued, again rightly, that he and the others being charged had never called for the violent overthrow of the US government. All of that was true. Dennis was correct in his defense, and yet all of the men were found guilty, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and given a $10,000 fine each. They failed. When the case went to the Supreme Court in 1951, the High Court upheld those convictions. So what this case showed, what this case is evidence of, is that guilt by association was beginning to be a standard in the war against possible communist subversion at home. Simply by being members of a group, they were considered guilty. That was their only act, was joining a group. There's no evidence that they actually gave speeches calling for the overthrow of the US government. There's no evidence of them committing any crimes to that effect. And yet they were found guilty simply because they joined a group. Though this Dennis case was, for example, Julius Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg was a former member of the Communist Party who worked with spies in the American nuclear program. Julius recruited other communists to act as spies and passed along to the Soviet Union secrets gathered by other spies. One of the spies that Julius Rosenberg worked with, was a man named David Greenglass, who was Ethelberg's brother. Julius and Ethel were husband and wife. David Greenglass was caught. Somebody snitched on him, and when Greenglass, Ethel's brother, was caught, he identified both Julius and his sister Ethel as go-betweens in their dealings with the Soviet Union. Julius and Rosenberg would both be executed by electric chair in June 1953 for espionage. Evidence that has come to light since then has revealed that Julius Rosenberg was indeed a spy for the Soviet Union. But in fact, Ethel was not. She was convicted of and executed for a crime she did not commit. Now, why did that happen? Even though there was no evidence against Ethel. Well, it's because David Greenglass, who was a witness in the case against them, later admitted that he lied to prosecutors about his own sister's involvement. It appears she was innocent and executed anyway alongside her husband. Why would her own brother identify her as a conspirator, as a spy, when in fact she was innocent? Well, Greenglass, in a dramatic twist, was trying to protect his own wife, and so he turned in his sister, who went to her death, an innocent woman. So there were legitimate reasons for fear, but there were also opportunists who entered the fray, capitalized on the real fears that people were feeling to further their own political careers. One of the most prominent was the man pictured here, Joseph McCarthy, Republican senator from Wisconsin. He came onto the paranoid scene and outdid everybody. The man was a self-aggrandizing opportunist, a liar, He lied about his service in World War II, and a heavy drinker. He was elected to the Senate in 1946. In 1950, he began thinking about his re-election campaign that was to come in a couple of years. And he met with a friend of his, a Catholic priest, and they brainstormed ideas. What would get McCarthy reelected? And the priest suggested anti-communism. Almost on a whim, McCarthy had his cause, his pet cause. In February 1950, he gave a speech at a Republican Party rally in West Virginia in which he claimed to know 57 members of the State Department who had communist ties. He said of the State Department, quote, "It is thoroughly infested with communists." He did not have a list of communists in his hand. The number he cited was made up. And over the ensuing years, that number would change. Nevertheless, McCarthy would call witnesses to testify before the Senate and grandstand and spread fear. By 1954, McCarthy had shamed himself in public as he began making accusations against the president for being a communist and high-ranking military officials for being communist. And in 1954, his career was in tatters, but not before he ruined many lives. Among the lives ruined in this suspicion about fellow Americans were many gay Americans. During Truman's loyalty review and continuing through the Cold War years, gay government workers came under scrutiny simply because of their sexuality. This targeting of gay individuals later became known as the Lavender Scare. Under Truman's Loyalty Review Board, 91 gay men had been dismissed from the State Department simply because they were gay. In 1950, a Senate subcommittee held hearings to investigate the alleged threat posed by gay men and lesbians. Here's a direct quote from the committee, a statement from the committee. I want to read it just to give you a sense of the prevailing attitude toward homosexuality at the time and the perverse rationale for targeting gay Americans. So this is from the committee itself. Quote, "The social stigma attached to sex perversion is so great that many perverts go to great lengths to conceal their perverted tendencies. This situation is evidence of the fact that perverts are frequently victimized by blackmailers who threaten to expose their sexual deviations. It is generally believed that those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons. These perverts will frequently attempt to entice normal individuals to engage in perverted practices. It is the experience of intelligence experts that perverts are vulnerable to interrogation by a skilled questioner, and they seldom refuse to talk about themselves." Note that they keep referring to gays and lesbians as perverts. Essentially, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, a perversion among people who were emotionally unstable and as a result prone to blackmail. When Dwight Eisenhower became president in 1953, he expanded Truman's loyalty program to include so-called, quote, sex perverts. And thousands of government workers lost their jobs because of the stigma against gays. Now note this article. Behind the scandal of the two traitors, how the Reds blackmail homosexuals into spying for them. And if you look at some of the other text here, you'll see the awful language used to describe these men who were presumed in this article to be gay, but they weren't. These were two men in the State Department who defected to the Soviet Union because they had communist sympathies. They were not lovers, they were not. But nevertheless, this article identified them as homosexuals, as perverts, as traitors. So these stigmas can become self-reinforcing. I mentioned a moment ago that a new president would follow Harry Truman. Republican Dwight Eisenhower would be elected in 1952 and assume office the following year. Eisenhower had been commander of Allied forces in World War II, also had been president of Columbia University. One of his first acts when he took office was to bring the Korean War to an end. He had promised to do so during the campaign, and one of the ways he did that was he reminded the combatants that the U.S. had nuclear weapons. But the Cold War would continue under Eisenhower. By the end of his presidency, tensions would escalate. We see in the second year of his presidency a new piece of legislation passed, the Communist Control Act of 1954. Now, this pulls no punches. It specifically outlaws the Communist Party in the United States. It makes it a crime to be a member of the Communist Party USA. So this is following up on what happened with the Dennis case, where the courts essentially criminalized membership in the Communist Party and associated groups already. Here, it was in black and white in legislation. Communist Party membership is now a crime. So this, of course, is meant to target Americans within the United States. And I've been focusing on federal measures originating in Washington, D.C. that apply nationwide, but they're also supplementing these more local and state measures. State police, city police would monitor suspected communist groups, sometimes set up task forces specifically to monitor potential subversives. Individual states would pass laws that targeted communists. Before the federal government outlaws membership in the Communist Party, some states had already done so. Some states banned communists from obtaining fishing licenses or participating in professional wrestling. Both those are true. So there was this widespread attempt by governments at every level, also by private businesses, and not just Hollywood, but elsewhere, to try to ferret out and segregate and separate out communists or potential subversives because of this fear of subversion from within. But the threats from abroad were never far from Americans' minds either. The stated policy under Eisenhower, when it came to using the destructive arsenal at its disposal, was mutual assured destruction. Perhaps appropriately, the acronym for mutual assured destruction is MAD. What this meant, MAD, what this meant was a promise that if the Soviet Union ever launched an attack, a nuclear attack, or hydrogen bombs on the United States would respond in kind, they would destroy each other. Now, the rationale for this, the idea behind this, is captured in this cartoon. The idea is that because the prospect of using these weapons, the potential end of the world, because the prospect of that is so frightening that the major powers will do everything they can to try to avoid the eventuality of war on that scale, on that destructive scale. And so they'll keep to lesser contests instead of all-out nuclear warfare. Well, short of nuclear war, there were other measures taken by the US under Eisenhower. The CIA, which I mentioned, was established in 1947. The federal group in charge of clandestine operations would intervene in other nations to try to install leaders who they thought would be sympathetic to the United States or favor American interests. So in 1953, Iran elects a prime minister. It's pictured there, Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, one part of Mossadegh's campaign platform was that he promised to nationalize oil in Iran. Now, this frightened capitalists of every stripe, but of course, in particular, European and American oil companies. So the CIA organizes a coup, works with rivals against Mossadegh within Iran to oust him from power. So here's a case of the US getting wind of somebody who seems hostile to free markets, to capitalism, even though he was not a communist, he was not directly affiliated with the Soviet Union or China or any communist power, but his promise to take Iran's oil reserves for the Iranians inspired Operation Ajax, the CIA operation to see to it that he was removed from power, and he was. An American president during the Cold War and everyone working for him in government, they had to have their eyes all over the world. We've seen interventions in Europe with the Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, etc. In Asia, the Korean War. In the Middle East, with the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. And also in Latin America, which we will talk about even more in a few moments. Something similar to what happened in Iran in 1953 occurs in 1954, Operation PB Success. And in this, the CIA organizes a coup of the popularly elected Guatemalan president, Arbenz. Now Arbenz, he ran on a platform of seizing lands from agribusiness, American fruit companies and agricultural companies. He argued that much of this land was fallow anyway. It wasn't being used by these companies, and he wanted to take it and distribute it among the people so that they could have their little plot of land to cultivate. That too, a whiff of socialism and communism, so the CIA organized a coup against Arbenz, and he was removed from power in Guatemala in 1954. So as mentioned, American president has to have his sights set all over the world. And so in 1957, Eisenhower issued his own doctrine to supplement the Truman Doctrine, which tended to focus on Europe and Asia. Eisenhower directs his doctrine toward the Middle East. And he says the free nations of the Mideast need, and for the most part want, added strength to assure their continued independence. There were many fronts in the war against the possible spread of communism. Containment required many measures and an investment in a tremendous amount of resources all over the world. So we've seen how these fears were affecting Americans directly. And these fears were further inculcated in the culture. So I posted this in the reading section of Blackboard if you'd like to take a look. The U.S. military and other arms of the federal government produced these films, you might call them propaganda films, warning Americans to be on the lookout for potential communists in their schools and their neighborhoods. And some of the advice they give is quite vague. Obvious ones are how to spot a communist is, well, one says they're a communist, or if they're part of a communist front group, or they advocate for the end of capitalism or democracy. But then they also warn that someone who doesn't do those things could just be hiding the fact that they're a communist. So in other words, the message is a communist could be anybody. It could be Alger Hiss. And so maybe paranoia might set in among some. And if not to that degree, it's a certain amount of fear, to be sure. And propaganda was not limited to the government. Even private groups got in on the act, like this group called the Cattle Guild Educational Society, which produced an anti-communist comic book, which you see on the screen there. And look at the frightening cover of Americans being insulted and the American flag burning. Here's how this group introduced this comic book. And remember, this is meant for kids. And they say, Is This Tomorrow is published for one purpose, to make you think, to make you more alert to the menace of communism. Skipping ahead a bit, communists themselves claim that every official party member, there are 10 others ready, willing, and able to do the party's bidding. These people are working day and night, laying the groundwork to overthrow your government. The average American is prone to say, it can't happen here. Millions of people in other countries used to say the same thing. Today they are dead, or living in communist slavery. It must not happen here. Let's take a closer look at this comic book. Is This Tomorrow? It wasn't long after the end of the Second World War that communist forces in America seized their chance. The story is sad, the end tragic. This is the way it began. Here they say that communists have infiltrated the news media, convincing them to follow the party line, and they'll be ready to take complete control of radio and publishing. Now, they don't accuse of all labor unions of being communist, but they do say that labor has been tricked into doing the communist bidding. Uh-oh, look out. Your professors are commies. I defy anyone to prove that there is such a thing as a God. Godless communism. Capitalists invented God to keep the workers satisfied. You can't get anywhere as long as you believe that pie-in-the-sky story. Even in grade schools, there you see a glassy-eyed girl as her teacher says, remember, you are supposed to obey the state, not your parents. Can you imagine being a child reading this and what you might think? Certainly, there's a paranoia that could set in, or certainly a mistrust of people trying to brainwash you. And furthermore, imagine sitting through films in school in which you're told that there's the possibility that a massive bomb could be dropped on your head. And what's your defense against it? Well, get on your desk, duck and cover. Now you see on the screen there, Bert the Turtle says duck and cover. This is from a film produced by the Civil Defense Administration, which is a lighthearted look at nuclear war. And that film is posted on Blackboard if you'd like to take a look. It's meant to appeal to kids and to affirm to them the threat that the United States is facing at the time. So these fears would penetrate every heart and mind through a variety of means, including in popular culture. It's reflected in films like The Red Menace, I Married a Communist. Not sure how you'd know, Red Underwear maybe. The Manchurian Candidate, a terrific film, even if a bit paranoid, from 1962. And the premise of it is that there were Americans captured in the Korean War, brainwashed to commit political assassinations and cause political disruption in the United States. And there is a character who's kind of a Joseph McCarthy figure, but in the film, he's a buffoon, well, like he was in real life, a buffoon who's distracting from the real threat of subversion. Even films that on their face do not have a communist theme could be interpreted, and in some ways were at the time, as metaphors for the fears of the Cold War. H.G. Wells's book, War of the Worlds, dates back several decades before this, but here it's updated. Martian invaders entering the United States. Or more subtly, what happens when invaders come and actually snatch people's bodies and alien invaders inhabit the bodies of humans? Could be seen as a powerful metaphor for internal communist subversion. Though to be clear, that wasn't always the filmmaker's intent, but sometimes the perception, that was the perception. Or in the midst of fears of nuclear war and the environmental impact of these technologies and weapons, could they create giant bugs that will run rampant through the United States, eating people like them, which creates giant ants? Now that's silly sci-fi, but toward the end of the decade, science fiction seemed to be becoming reality. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into space, Sputnik, kicking off the space race. So this further shows how the Cold War involves so much more than military actions, and whether it's with conventional weapons or arms buildup or spying and other things we associate with war making. Also, investing in infrastructure and science and education, these were all part of this competition between the nations, because this was ideological conflict where the United States and Soviet Union were both trying to prove that their systems, their ways of life, one was superior over the other. Now, to be sure, the space race, there were also possible military implications here, and there was a fear that if the Soviets could launch Sputnik into outer space, maybe soon they'll launch rockets into space, or rocket launchers into space that could be aimed at targets across the United States. Concerns closer to home, in fact, people's actual homes also figured into the debate. In July of 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon, he was Eisenhower's vice president after serving as a congressman from California, Richard Nixon visited Moscow and met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev succeeded Stalin after Stalin's death in 1953 at an American national exhibition. This exhibition featured an American kitchen, and you see them at this expo of the American kitchen. And what followed was known as the kitchen debate. For 12 days in 1959, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States from coast to coast. He met Marilyn Monroe, but unfortunately had to cancel his visit to Disneyland because of security concerns. And in his meetings with Nixon in Moscow and later in the United States, they held forth a friendly debate in which Nixon made the argument that the American system was superior. The Soviets were promising a classless society, a society without social class. And Nixon says that the American system will produce such a classless society because a rising tide lifts all boats. Soon all Americans will have a kitchen like this. Of course, he was exaggerating. As we saw last time, there was still significant poverty in the U.S. at the end of the 1950s. But this captures this ideological debate. It wasn't just about who had more bombs, though that was, of course, part of it. It was about who had the know-how, who had the grit, who had the determination, and who had the superior system that would encourage a people to reach their potential. That debate lasted throughout the Cold War. Now, the fact that the Soviet premier and the US vice president could meet each other under these circumstances and have a kind of friendly debate, and if you find some of the film footage of these discussions and debates, you'd see that they're kind of lighthearted. This suggests that there was some measure of thawing in the relations between the new nations, but that new ease, that easing of tensions, would not last. That same year, in 1959, a revolution in Cuba ended with the communists in that country victorious. Behind the scenes, American clandestine services, the CIA, would work to try to oust Cuba's new leader, Fidel Castro, in the same way that they had ousted the leaders of Guatemala and Iran earlier in the decade, but without success. And they tried a number of different methods of trying to eliminate Castro, exploding cigars, poison-tipped umbrellas, James Bond stuff. But Fidel Castro would remain in power. In fact, he died only recently. The following year, the so-called U-2 incident occurred in May 1960. The U-2 was a spy plane. These were American planes that would fly over areas and snap pictures. On May 1960, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, publicly made an accusation against the United States that the U.S. was spying on the Soviets on Soviet soil. Eisenhower denied it, said that's false, the U.S. does not do that. And then Khrushchev produced Powers the pilot, and Eisenhower could no longer deny the presence of this spy plane over the Soviet Union. Now, Powers himself was kind of vilified in America because he was supposed to hide or take his own life rather than submit to capture. But he would be captured and face a show trial and be convicted to a 10-year sentence, which Eisenhower condemned and many Americans condemned. Later, Powers would be exchanged for a captured Soviet spy, so he would not serve that full sentence. So this is May 1960. Later that year, it's time for another presidential election. Like clockwork, every 4 years. In 1960, the candidates were Richard Nixon, a familiar face. He's the Republican nominee. He had been a member of HUAC when he was a congressman from California, so he had bona fides as an anti-communist. But he also showed that he could be a diplomat. He had met with Khrushchev and had light-hearted exchanges in those kitchen debates. And Nixon was also Eisenhower's vice president. Running against him was U.S. Senator John F. Kennedy, a veteran of World War II from a very wealthy and prominent Kennedy family. A young, dashing up-and-comer. Now, in their debates in this 1960 campaign, the Cold War was very much on the candidates' minds. Nixon, as I said, had his own anti-communist bona fides to run on. He was one of the leading anti-communists who led hearings. His administration, in the Eisenhower administration, had ended the Korean War and put in place a policy of mutual assured destruction. Kennedy, for his part, called out the Eisenhower administration for, quote, losing Cuba, and he harped on what he called a missile gap, which he suggested that the Soviet Union was outproducing the United States in missiles. In fact, it was not. Kennedy won the presidency in one of the narrowest victories ever, and he would soon get a chance to confront the Cold War. Berlin would become a center of conflict once again. Rhetoric between the US and the Soviet Union was escalating, and the arms race was picking up. And in Berlin, the Western sector, thanks in part to the Marshall Plan, was thriving, while the Soviet sector was struggling mightily. And as a result, many fled the East for the West. Now, this, in an ideological conflict, if people are trying to flee your system for a better system, not look good in this Cold War for the Soviets. In 1958, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev warned the West that if they did not remove their forces from West Germany, he would put in place a permanent blockade. He did not act on that threat, but he made it again in 1961. Western allies refused, and the Soviets responded by constructing the Berlin Wall. Now, strangely, at the time when the wall first went up, it was actually met with a sigh of relief from many Americans, politicians in the press and in the public, who feared that this conflict would lead to something wider and more bloody. But this wall, which was meant to keep Berliners in the East from escaping to the West, would become a symbol of the divisions in the world, the Iron Curtain made real. And decades later, when the Soviet Union finally fell and Germany was reunited, the coming down of that wall became a powerful symbol for the change that would occur with the fall of the Communist Empire and the Soviet Union. More alarmingly, the Cold War hit closer to home in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. As we saw, A few years earlier, the Cuban Revolution brought the communist regime of Fidel Castro to power. Rebuked by the United States, which actively sought to remove Castro from power, Castro turned to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. The Soviets provided Cuba with nuclear missiles, and in 1962, an American spy plane, a U-2 plane, spotted these weapons of mass destruction in Cuba, in America's backyard. In response, U.S. President John F. Kennedy put in place what he called a quarantine, which was ships surrounding Cuba, which would not allow arms to reach the island. He did not use the term blockade, which would prevent all goods, food, everything from reaching Cuba, or rather what he called a quarantine, which these American ships would prevent the delivery of weapons, missiles to Cuba. After 13 intense days of back-channel negotiations and many people sitting on edge, an agreement was made between the US, Cuba, and the Soviet Union. And to end this confrontation, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, which was the top priority for the US government. The US agreed not to invade Cuba, and also agreed, in a secret part of this arrangement, agreed to move American missiles from the nation of Turkey. In the wake of this threat of imminent nuclear war, the US and the Union entered into agreements to ban nuclear tests in the atmosphere. So there was this bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis actually led to a temporary easing of tensions and actual agreements to at least limit nuclear testing in the atmosphere. So some measure of cooperation followed the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the fears could not be eradicated. And we see those seeping into popular culture. It's not a coincidence that soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see the introduction of the Incredible Hulk, Bruce Banner, saving a child from a gamma bomb test. There's the countdown. And he's trapped in the blast. But he's not destroyed. He's rather bathed in those gamma rays. And Bruce Banner becomes the Hulk. So once again, we see pop culture responding to a world of very real threats and fears. So the Cold War was, in many ways, all-encompassing. It was, yes, this contentious rivalry between the US and Soviet Union that led to proxy wars and other conflicts. And also, in some instances, turned American against American, and fear seeped into the culture. And many looked at one another with suspicion. Still, even within this context, there was the possibility and the achievement of some significant change. And that came with the push for civil rights and the expansion of rights for African Americans, women, black and white, and many others. We'll pick up there next week.